So I am Miranda. I am the research associate in archiving and preserving open access books as part of the COPIM project. So the COPIM project is community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs. It is an internationally funded partnership of researchers, universities, established open access publishers, libraries, and infrastructure providers. And there are 7 work packages in COPIM. Some of them deal with new funding models. Some of them deal with governance, experimental publishing. But work package 7 is on archiving and preservation. So just a little bit more about COPIM. Generally, it is dedicated to investigating the difficulties that impede the progress of small publishers interfacing with large-scale organizations and processes. So we are looking at the little guys. Community-owned, scholar-led, not-for-profit, open infrastructures, and scaling small are part of our ethos. The work package 7 is dedicated to the key challenges associated with archiving research monographs in all their variation and complexity, I should say digital monographs, and work towards developing new solutions. So once again, we are focusing on the small and scholar-led presses, which often miss out on commercial or institutional support. So one of the things that I think is part of what we're doing is the understanding that sometimes we come up with a lot more questions than we do answers, but that is part of the fun. So I'm just going to read through some of the various questions that we're looking at, and then I'll talk a little bit briefly, very briefly, about one of the solutions we're trying to formulate now. So one of them is, what are the boundaries of a book? How are complex digital monographs preserved? What are the risks to archived content? Should there be an access copy and an archive copy? In terms of embedded and linked content, so a complex monograph is something that isn't just text, it's got other things embedded in it or accompanying it. So what are the boundaries of those things for preservation? Whose responsibility is it? And now some of these questions are not just ones that we're asking, they're ones that are also addressed by people who are also on this panel. So that's important, that, that's part of the reason we're having a dialogue. And how might a distribution platform assist in some of the gathering of the content together that may be distributed elsewhere? So also, should open access publishing mean open access preservation and archiving? And that's one of the things that we're looking at within COPIM that maybe is slightly different to some of the partners on the panel. And would it be possible to easily incorporate this, maybe a network of repositories, into a platform that would also incorporate into publisher workflows? Now, why is this important? This, in terms of particularly the small and scholar-led press, many large-scale presses have existing relationships, with digital preservation services. And in our scoping report, we detail the findings of interviews and surveys that we had with various small and scholar-led presses, where we found a lack of consistent practice, often without support of a memory institution, lack of staff, financial, and technological resource, and no direct relationship with a digital preservation service. So one of the things that we're looking at is using TOTE. TOTE is the Open Metadata Management Service that's part of COPIM. And by using that platform that's being created, seeing if there's a way that we could create a network of willing repositories that would be a part of a push-button deposit for OA monographs and accompanying materials into a repository of choice. Long-term goal is developing that willing network, potentially involving national libraries. At its simplest, TOTE will have links to both textual and associated material, and the system will use those links to transfer the available content to a partner repository. And our aim is to simplify this process to a single Send to Archive button. We are hoping to do this by the end of April 2023, which is the end of the current project. But we also have a funding bid in, hoping to extend that further. So that's me for now.
Okay, my turn. So I'm Karen Hanson. I'm the Senior Research Developer for Portico, and I'm representing a project called Embedding Preservability for New Forms of Scholarship. It's actually a follow-on from another project that was 80 months long. This one's 3 years long. The first one was called Enhancing Services for New Forms of Scholarship, and it helps to give a background of what happened during that project, just to lead up to it. So that project involved, both projects were led by NYU Libraries and funded by the Mellon Foundation. So the first project, basically two preservation services, Clocks and Portico, evaluated about 20 publications that were considered new forms of scholarship. What do I mean by that? It's basically anything beyond the traditional publication, anything with embedded video or linked data. Some of them have 3D visualizations that are their navigation for the publication. Some of them have custom-built websites, and so on. So we looked at a series of 20 of these and tried to figure out if we had, not 20, but thousands, could we do something scalable with these as a service that works at scale. So we analyzed each one and then tried to imagine what would happen if we tried to do this at scale. And where we found issues for preservation, we documented them and gave feedback to the publishers about what might have been done differently along the way that could have made these uniform enough to get into a scalable model. And so across the 20 publications, we ended up with quite a long list of recommendations, and those formed what we call guidelines for preserving new forms. And these are intended to be shared with publishers so that they have some guidance on what, if they want to make things more preservable, then this is what they can do to sort of improve things for these complex works. But what we found after this 18-month project, there was sort of a limited perspective in these guidelines because they'd been done by preservation services that weren't publishers, and we'd been basically given something at the end of the workflow and sort of making projections about what might have happened or what could have been done. And so we wanted to gather evidence to see if we could get into the publisher workflow and implement these, will they actually work? Are they reasonable to suggest? Or, are we asking for impossible requests? And so that started the 3-year project. It's 3 years because we want to go end to end in the publishing cycle. So we're working with monographs and journals. This time the first project was just monographs. And so we have, it's called Embedding Preservability because we're actually embedding a team of 4 into publisher workflows. So we're getting in from the beginning when they're talking to the authors, and we're using the guidelines as a template to make suggestions about what they might do along the way. And so the idea is we'll gather feedback from that to see, what just gets blocked, no way, what's more flexible, and how can we improve the usability of these guidelines, basically. And so the idea is to then iterate based on this feedback. As part of the project, we're also working with the platforms that are responsible, that are working with these publishers. So we have 4 platforms involved. And so the hope is that we go through a similar process with them where we get a walkthrough and make recommendations and see how much we can actually push towards preservation, if anything. So that's the project. So pass it to Alicia.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. My name's Alicia, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the JASPER project. JASPER is a collaborative project led by the Directory of Open Access Journals, and the other partners include Clocks. Let me see if I can get this in alphabetical order. The Internet Archive, and colleagues Jefferson and Thomas from the Internet Archive are here today. PKP-PN is the other partner, and the Keepers Registry from the ISSN International Agency. And we formed as a project group in response to a really interesting paper published by Michael Laxo 3 years ago. In this paper, Michael and his colleagues demonstrated that looking across the web at open access journals revealed that over 100 open access journals had disappeared entirely and couldn't be retrieved or found. These were journals that were published between 2000 and 2019. They were published in all parts of the world. They were published in all subject areas. So there were open access journals that had disappeared from the United States, from all parts of Europe, and further abroad as well. And together, the project partners came together, and we thought that we could collaborate to try and find some scalable approaches to helping support open access publishers become more preserved, more widely preserved. So we began by looking into the DOAJ index, and we've identified around 7,000 titles that are at risk, that are open access, that do not appear to be preserved digitally anywhere. And we've prioritized the subset of that material, which are diamond open access journals. And diamond OA journals are those without charged for business models. They don't charge article processing charges. They don't charge subscription fees. So looking in at the diamond open access journals, what we've essentially done is created a human pipeline and a technical pipeline. So the DOAJ colleagues, first in writing and then in discussion, reach out and talk to the people publishing these journals. These are often scholar-led journals, so they are reaching out to talk to researchers who create and manage and publish these journals really as a labor of intellectual love. When the journal publishers are interested in being preserved, then they hand over to one of the preservation partners to continue the conversations. That's what I mean by the human pipeline. There's also a very technical and interesting pipeline that's been created. The DOAJ interface has been changed, so the journal publishers can indicate that they would like their content preserved. And then Internet Archive has created a pipeline. The content and metadata can flow from DOAJ into the Internet Archive pipeline, and from there it could be harvested by the existing pilot archiving partners, but the plan is to open this up to additional archives in future. Because we're essentially dealing with a long tail problem. There are thousands of these journals. They're worth looking after. We need to find ways that are easy and simple for the publishers, the academics, but we also need to find cost-effective ways for the preservation services to be able to obtain and ingest and preserve the materials as well. And so I guess we'll be talking about some of the challenges and opportunities around that as we go forward.
Right, with that, I'm going to move to the middle. And I've got a few questions that I would like to ask of you and take turns in answering. The first one, you're obviously one side of the equation, you're on the consumer side, let's call it that, of the equation. On the other side, we have the publishers. So I was wondering, what sort of level of reception have your projects had with the publishers regarding your solutions and suggestions for preserving content or creating more preservable content? And I'm also interested as well, does the size of the publisher affect how they perceive you and your projects?
You want me to go first? I'll just talk briefly. So as I've already said, we are focusing on the small and scholar-led open access publisher. And so that's who we've primarily been speaking with. And really, as I've already mentioned, there's kind of a lack of consistent practice. Some are aware of preservation, some have some kind of practice, others don't. And so I think really there's a lot of concern from the publishers about the future and what that means, because there are, various funder mandates on the horizon, some that are already, giving technical requirements in the UK for the journal side of things, and the anticipation is that will apply to the monograph publishers in the next few years. And so those who don't have anything in existence, they're kind of worried, they're concerned, and they also want guidance. So one of the outcomes of Work Package 7 is to create a good, better, best practice guide, not one that sets out anything in particular that they have to do, but if you have this option, this is what will happen, and this is the pros and cons of that. So that's something that, but there's a lot of hunger for help us, we don't know what to do. This is something we know is important, but because of our resource levels, because we have maybe 1.5 people working on the press, we don't have an easy option for this. So part of the, what we're looking at is how we can assist them at a good or basic level, and then stepping up from there.
So in terms of the publishers we're working with, there's definitely a sort of selection bias there, because they've all agreed to participate on a preservation project and work with this for a number of hours through their process. So they've invited us in. I think in terms of actually getting traction with any of the suggestions we're making, it's a bit early in the process just to see about the bigger ones, but we're noticing where we get a lot of traction right away is when they're trying to do something that they haven't figured out yet. Like in one project, they inherited a Flash file, and they asked for guidance. They had a little bit of funding to do something with it, and so they asked us for guidance through that process, and we actually had an influence on that. But where it's harder, I think, is when things are already established and we're trying to change something that already exists. So in terms of size, and I should say a lot of these institutions have already thought quite a lot about preservation. In terms of size, I think most of them are kind of mid-size university presses, maybe some a little bit bigger. We are aiming to work with some smaller institutions later in the project, but we haven't got there yet. But I think something that is playing a role other than size is a lot of the projects that they have in their system, and actually the systems themselves were started with funding from a grant organization that cares a lot about preservation, and so I think there's some motivation there to sort of fulfill that agenda for the funding organization as well.
And for us, from a COC's perspective, we talk to publishers all the time. We're preserving digital content for large and small publishers with all business models and all sorts of different configurations. So that's normal bread and butter work for us, as it is for Portico as well. The interesting thing with the group of publishers coming in through the JASPER project is that they're much more multinational than our existing user community. So before Project JASPER, we were ingesting content from 45 different countries, and that's expanded to 53 countries in 1 year. And so that presents some terrific opportunities, also exploring new partnerships with archives in the countries where these publishers are based, to figure out whether we can collaborate to help archives in those countries create a more comprehensive collection of their locally published materials. So that's a new opportunity. Lots of new relationships are emerging. There are also linguistic challenges that come with that widening multinational footprint, though. So we're learning, we're relying on Google Translate probably too much, but it gets us forward. The other thing I'd say is that as Karen mentioned, by the time a publisher is talking to me, they've already spoken to people at DOAJ, they've agreed that they want their content preserved. But I know from talking to DOAJ colleagues that other publishers fall out before that stage. They are either not convinced that this is a priority for them, or they don't really understand what's involved, or they don't have time right now. For those who make it through, who I get to speak to, they're enthusiastic about having their journals preserved. Actually, they see this as a real mark of prestige and status, and a form of international recognition that their journal, but more important, their field of scholarship belongs in the scholarly record for the long term. And that's really exciting, actually, to be part of that, to be serving them in that way. There can be lots of practical problems that we need to figure out ways to overcome. These are usually one or two academics behind the journals. They don't often seem to have much contact with their libraries. They're not backed up, as far as I've been able to tell, by a university press, the university IT department, or any kind of formal publisher. It's just one or two academics who may not have many technical skills, who may not know what the word metadata means in any language. They have really found it difficult that we ask them to sign a contract giving us the rights to preserve their journal in the long term, and not a single one has known if they were authorized to sign an agreement or who on their campus they should talk to. So actually we've been helping them to build some connections within their own institutions, and often starting with the library as a new partner. So that's been very interesting. And then they're just lovely to work with. They're on a huge learning curve, but they're just so proud. And it makes such a nice difference. We are approached every day by, I would say, between 5 and 10 predatory publishers of various kinds that we have to bat away. And it's such a privilege, this project, to be connected to genuine, tiny publishers that have terrific material and who are really advancing their subject areas, and being able to work with them to support greater visibility and discoverability now and the future for that content.
I think that should be the title of your next paper. Passion publishing versus predatory publishing. I'm going to ask one more question here before I open up to the floor. I do have many questions here, but one more that all three of you touched on problems, challenges. What's been the biggest challenge you faced in order to get to where you are now?
I suppose this one's a tricky one because I've only been on the COPIM project slightly over a year. So I know that COPIM's, dealt with a number of challenges. But I think, given that we're a relatively small project, it's understanding where the boundaries of our work can reach now and where we hope to try and get them to in the future. And I think that, we are very fortunate to have, good connections with a lot of other projects and a lot of other organizations that are, helping to fill in the gaps where we can't possibly get to as the little guy. But, I think that, again, those sorts of challenges just mean, the importance of community is ever more important, and that there's many opportunities for further collaboration, and that's really important.
So in terms of challenges, I think there's a nuts and bolts challenges of the publications we're looking at. There's no uniformity. They're very creative, but just the technical challenge of having tools that can actually do scalable actions. They're not in a condition where we can get a high fidelity copy at the moment. So that's just a sort of technical challenge. I think the other challenge we've noticed is sort of being able to get any movement on things that have already been done. So things that are already published, code that's already written, modules already written, workflows already established. I think people it sort of shows the value of needing to be there when the decisions are made, just the kind of traction we're able to get right now. And that means I think there's a resource problem there because we can't be everywhere, in every publication workflow to sort of catch things as they happen. And so the guidelines are supposed to be a surrogate for that, but then you first need to kind of make the argument that they're needed. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with this project, is start to make that argument and show what this process can do, not just for preservation, but maybe also for things like sustainability. We saw publications that were starting to, fail after a year or even 6 months with pieces breaking. And, there was a presentation earlier today about having to get something behind a firewall to preserve it because it had to be taken offline. So I can sort of imagine that happening over time. And hopefully the process we're going through will gradually make that argument. But I've noticed all of these kinds of things take a very long time to get any movement in research processes. So one step at a time.
And I guess we've moved forward overcoming challenges around technology and workflows and communication and engagement. But right now, the really big challenge facing us is around business models. So how are we going to be able to afford sustainably to continue engaging with the very long tail of open access journal publishers, expanding out beyond Diamond OA journals and thinking about books? The long tail is incredibly daunting. I think it will take our entire community and beyond to be able to address this scale of problem. And how do we sustain funding then for the engagement, for the technical infrastructure that's needed, and for the support as well as the long-term preservation costs? Well, we've been reaching out as a group in the JASPER project to a wide array of different funding bodies. And some of our partners in the project are able to apply for grant funding. So will this become part of our core mission and central funding? Possibly. Other funders that we're approaching don't fund preservation infrastructure. That's not within their remit, but they do support open access publishing in various ways. So they're trying to think about whether they can create a funding stream to support authors or titles in their sphere of influence, whether that's a subject area or a country or a region. And I think this is just beginning this conversation about how we afford over time to ingest and preserve and look after this material and make it discoverable and usable more broadly.
Dare I say it, it's all about the money? in joke. Okay, so I have more questions here, but let's have some questions and thoughts from the floor. Anything you want to ask or any statement you'd like to make? I believe we haven't got anything online at the moment. Oh, we've got two. So we'll start here and then over there.
I know you're reaching out to small publishers who you think are in the DOAJ who are at risk. What about embedding it in things like the Open OJS? Because I have colleagues who run journals on the OJS platform, and that's really being taken up quite a lot now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of our project partners is PKPPN, and in our acronym soup, I should have made it clear that that's the same organization that runs OJS. So actually, that's a really important point. Working with the platforms that are hosting this content is incredibly powerful because they're good intermediaries who can, again, leverage their human connections and the fact that they've got access to the content to help facilitate preservation. So exactly right.
Yeah, and likewise, part of the design of our project was we specifically wrote the platforms into the grant that are working with the publishers we're working with, and we're having separate interviews with them because we see it as the most powerful way to sort of put changes into the workflows. And actually, we also have an Open Journal System plugin that we helped develop, so we definitely support that kind of approach of helping the platforms develop in the directions that will facilitate preservation more easily. So that's something that this project in particular is a great opportunity to start that dialogue with some platforms that are being used by publishers of all sizes. So.
Good question there.
Thank you. Alexander Roberts, Swansea University. We, like a lot of universities, publish and support publishing via OJS and all sorts of things. The question is about IP, copyright, famously difficult and tortuous within universities. And I was just wondering, as Alicia, you were talking about the conversation with the academics who are frequently a lone academic behind the publishing of these very small-scale journals. Are you developing any kind of knowledge base to support academics then as part of what you're doing? Because IP is so difficult to disentangle from this as part of the research output of the university. The university itself has an interest in these journals, but they're often under the radar. So in having this conversation and looking for someone to sign something, all of a sudden it's almost a dangerous time for that journal and its existence. So just interested in any learning that you can share.
Oh, that's a brilliant idea to create a knowledge base that might be shared. That's not something we're doing, that we're creating information that could be used to populate such a thing, and we'd be delighted to share. So what we do at Clocks, and I assume it's similar at Portico, we do ask the publisher to grant us rights in perpetuity to the content insofar as they own or control it. And an interesting thing is, I think publishers of all kinds, of all shapes, of all sizes, of all styles, probably need help and support in thinking through how they're going to inform their authors and get their authors' support for the author's rights in those materials to also be available clearly for preservation. And as far as I know, there's not well-established good practice in this space at all. From talking to researchers about it, just to explore whether we've got a rights problem on our hands, my limited experience, I've been in this space only for 18 months, is that all of the researchers we've so far spoken to love the idea that their output is being preserved. And so this seems like a good, positive news story. And libraries, preservation services, and publishers could perhaps work together to get this good news story out a little bit more broadly.
And yeah, I second that as well on that point. Publishers of all sizes, especially because we're dealing with complex new forms. Sometimes it's not even clear to us with some copyright background in the digital environment. They're trying to translate sort of sometimes print protocols to now you've got these sort of iframes and multimedia and sort of establishing, there's some sort of human workflow process that needs to be added there sometimes to make sure that you can get the rights. Like some publications have a YouTube video in it and they don't necessarily reach out to see if we can get permission to copy that. And so you have to kind of, so there's education, I think, across the board that and maybe standardization that we have to think about.
Just to quickly add that while while we're limited in the scope for the current iteration of the COPIM project, we are hoping that should the funding come through, that outreach and education for academics and libraries around preserving OA content would be something that's a part of what we would deliver in that next session.
That response gives a nice segue into another question here. There's an evident knowledge gap between the average researcher understanding of the needs and aims of preservation and the actuality. What solutions are you working towards in order to solve that gap, and what future possibilities exist?
Well, I guess following on from what I've already said, what we're hoping is to, work with Open Books Network and some other organizations to create more of a community that, again, in that future pie in the sky project that we're hoping is funded, that is something that we think is a huge barrier all along the pipeline, is these knowledge gaps. And we're kind of hoping in our grandest dreams to, even, aim some of this at, the PhD level researcher so that it gets in on the ground floor and that there's an understanding there. And then also libraries can help direct them a little bit better. Obviously, there are some libraries that are really already very good with this kind of thing, or at least related ideas, and that's great. But we are hoping to contribute there in that way.
Well, I think there is a need, as perhaps we've already mentioned, for toolkits to help libraries, publishers, and other interested parties to engage with researchers about why preservation is important, how it's done, what it costs, what the professional skills involved in it are, what the rights issues are, and to build champions at leadership levels within universities and other places where research is conducted. This feels to me like it needs a collaborative community. This is a job for iPres and IFLA and other similar organizations with global reach. So it'd be really good to have any suggestions or advice about how to get conversations started within our community about how we might collaborate on those sorts of toolkits.
And I guess for our project, our approach is to go through the publishers as the interface between the researcher and their publication, and use that interaction as an opportunity to sort of educate, but also then to have things in the platforms that the researchers can, they get into certain practices that are helpful for preservation. And then on top of that, our guidelines are actually intended for any content creators, although they were sort of initially developed for publishers. Anybody could read them and use them, and we've heard from some publishers that they're actually making their own version to share with the people that they work with. So,
you mentioned the interface. I'm going to come back to the integration of workflows in a bit, but I pick up on something that was mentioned just now about funders and funding and so on. Could you tell us a bit about what current funder policies are having, or standards, are having a positive or even a negative impact on digital preservation of OA content, and where possibly new policies might be needed to influence and further development digital preservation and workflows in this area?
So two standout policies that are really powerful. The Coalition S's Plan S is fantastic. It names preservation services explicitly as a requirement to be compliant with Plan S and eligible for open access funding from a wide array of important international research funders. So fantastic. And the other thing I would say is that data curation mandates of various kinds are just so helpful in getting researchers to think about what they're doing, what they're documenting, how they're sharing, who else will pick up the baton of looking after those data sets in the long term. And we can leverage that as effectively for text preservation as we can any other kind of data set. So those would be my two shout outs.
Yeah, I guess just to say, historically, it feels like standards and policies have kind of worked together in an interesting way. If we look at traditional publications, so one of the formats we use for preservation is JATS, which was originally formulated for a deposit into the NLM digital repository, the National Library of Medicine in the US. And so that sort of led the platforms to then, use that standard as an output because they wanted to be able to put their stuff directly into that. So that's one example. So I think the problem we're having with new forms is there's not a lot of standards. There's piecemeal standards for bits of what's going on, and there's no one place to kind of say this is maybe all of the standards you need to be able to do this and sort of package it up. So I think in terms of policies, there's things that are in place, like the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US again has you expected to write a section for digital preservation, and that came about because of the loss of all these digital humanities projects and the problems, of all of this money spent on projects and then being lost. So, but I think the problem sometimes is that they don't have. There's not sort of a standard for how to write that bit, and it's sort of hard to do follow up. And so I think there needs to be some standards in the area that I'm working on right now, and then that can maybe tie nicely with some of the policies that are already out there that could be sort of firmer in how to write them, I guess.
I mean, obviously, there's already been a lot that's been positive said here, but I think one thing that just in the context of what we're working on with the small and the scholar-led publishers is that I think they're often forgotten in terms of their limitations when certain policies are written. And so if they are not to be excluded by default, then I think there needs to be a focus on funding in order so that there is not a loss in that area of really important and significant scholarly knowledge, just because the press says, okay, well, this policy's come out, there's no way we can do it, what do we do? Do we shut down? Whatever. I mean, that's obviously an extreme version of events, but just that as a point, I think is important that people who make these policies keep that in mind.
And if I could mention one gap or an area that could be strengthened, there are a lot of touch points between our community and all parts of the publishing community. But a particularly powerful touch point are agreements of any kind that are signed, whether that's an author publishing agreement, whether that's a license agreement between a university and a publisher, or open access funding streams from a university library or a funder to a publisher for OA publishing. And in all of those agreements, it is possible to insert clauses about the importance and, in fact, requirements for preservation. And that creates a huge pull then from people who are important to publishers, their authors and their customers. I'm working with a group of librarians right now, and we're doing a survey of existing agreements and existing language in these sorts of agreements. And it's usually absent, and it's increasingly kind of vague. And I think the context, why that language is important, has perhaps been lost over time. So there's a real opportunity to kind of strengthen and reconnect and align internationally potentially in that space. That's really powerful.
Okay, so putting your mouth where your brain is, or whatever, if there was one policy that you could have enacted, created, that would make your life easier, what would it be? Something you could say, make it so.
I would put the funders' pocketbooks where their mouths are. So there are a lot of
That's the money.
a lot of mandates around, making sure you have a data management plan, requiring you to preserve your data, and there's very little funding that goes along with that. And it's a kind of a hollow mandate, an unfunded mandate.
Can't improve on that excellent answer. I mean, I think you can have all the policies you want, but as you pointed out, if you can't afford to follow the policy, then that's a problem. And I think, again, going back to the platform issue, I think if they could fund even the platforms to apply the standards to the degree possible, that would affect, because a lot of the small publishers use things like open journal systems, that would have a massive impact, so.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just a little added-on thought, but it's in one of the surveys that we looked at, something like 80-something%, felt that it would be important to have a central repository for OA monographs, at least at the national level, that involved preservation, so that the publishers themselves don't have to solve a problem the funders have set. And I think that that's something that I would include in that, is that would be an important component.
We can wish. We can hope. Before I segue into the question there. Does the microphone come down to you?
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question. I do remember last month, White House released the OSTP document. So that means the all federal funded research should release immediately and open access. So as a publisher, what's your reaction to this? I know in European country, they have a policy a long time ago, but that's the US, maybe it was last month, so there's a new release. Thank you.
So none of us is a publisher. We're preservation service providers that work with publishers and libraries. And I don't know about you guys, but the publishers we work with have every possible different response to policy developments in this space that you can imagine. So
no, never, not no.
Yeah, so that's quite a creative space. From my perspective, I think the OSTP memo is really helpful. It will make more content accessible now, and it positions us all to be able to preserve content for the future. But I suppose it might be an example of an unfunded mandate in terms of how that content will be looked after, especially the new data mandates. There seems to be an assumption that the content will be hosted by US federal funding agencies in their repositories, in their budgets, and that's a great start, but it doesn't feel as open as it potentially could be.
Yeah, no, I have nothing to add to that. That's exactly my thoughts.
I have a few thoughts about the technology and the workflows. Obviously, the publishers have their own technology and workflows, and the preservers have their own technology and workflows, and you are trying to work at the interface. So how are you approaching their side to promote resilience, to promote preservation at root, at core, and how are you approaching the integration of those workflows to make it work across the barrier?
I guess I'll go ahead and start. Our approach is very simple in many ways, because again, we're trying to capture the small or scholarly press that has nothing else in place, nothing at all, or but basically, or they want to do that bit more. But the tote archiving network would have a single push button, either send to ePrints or DSpace or Figshare. I mean, obviously, we're working right now with the UK-centric, the repository technology, but then their workflow would basically go push a button and it's gone. And rather than it being a huge undertaking for them to figure it out. So that's our approach, and we know that that's minimal, but again, that's covering the baseline.
Yeah, and I guess for our project, at least for the extent of the project, we're actually physically embedded in the process. So there is an integration obviously there, but the intention is to use this to sort of create these guidelines and sort of build longer term relationships that will allow us to sort of anticipate the changes that are happening and help maybe guide them, maybe join standards committees and things that are going to help sort of move in the direction of preservation. And then, of course, there's a tooling up end of things where we need to keep evaluating what tools we have and how we can make that gap smaller and smaller, because there's definitely a gap right now that can't be bridged easily with some of the more complex material.
Yeah, and then I'll answer from a CLOC's perspective, and then perhaps ask Jefferson if he wants to say something from a JASPER perspective. But from CLOC's, we recognize publishers as a key stakeholder in digital preservation because, unlike in the print world, when a library had a collection of objects that they could look after, in the digital world for preservation, I'm talking to the choir here, you guys all know this, but obviously the person who has the content and has created it and who is looking after it for the long term has an interest in it, but more than that, has control over access and is essential to involve as a result. So on our board, 50% of the representatives are publishers, 50% are libraries. And we do tap into the technical expertise from that community. We seek to influence both directly and indirectly through that publishing community, the standards that are evolving in those spaces. And it's not just one space. There are clubs where commercial publishers swim. There are clubs where university presses swim. There are clubs where library presses swim. There's not a club at the minute for Diamond OA publishers, and I think maybe that's something we're helping to create in JASPER. But Jefferson, do you want to say something as well from the Internet Archive?
Sure. So I guess with the JASPER project, we were just trying to build on the idea of bringing preservation to where smaller publishers are already living. And as Alicia gracefully noted, the long tail is really challenging. They don't have the resources, the expertise, the money, anything, and they're never going to, so you just have to accept that. So in that type of community, getting the preservation activity into where they're already doing things, whether that's a plugin or in our case, an integration with the DOAJ platform where they are uploading their article metadata, which they have to do to be a DOAJ member. So if you can fit preservation in there, then that's an elegant solution for them because it is a workflow they're already using. I would say in prior to that project, we had, Internet Archive at least, has had conversations with trying to get a similar approach for larger OA publishers that do have resources like PLOS and eLife and places like that. And the challenge, which we didn't expect, was that they, in many cases, don't actually create or manage their manuscript publishing processing systems internally. It's usually off-the-shelf software, or they've vendored it out or something like that. And therefore, it actually becomes very complex for them to embed an integration or some sort of preservation technical operation into their manuscript systems internally, which was not something we had expected. We figured they had full control of this and they could write a plugin in their own thing or figure out an API integration or something. So that was an interesting case, which is maybe a little informative that sometimes even the bigger publishers don't necessarily have the easy ability to fully do these type of integrations due to just internal plumbing type of things. So that was an interesting discovery. I don't know how to fix that problem, but there's some anecdotal evidence.
Thanks. Thank you. Are there any other contributions from the floor or online? In that case, could we say thank you to the panel?